Well, good evening and welcome to the 2015 IISS Oppenheimer Lecture. 10 years ago, Nicky Oppenheimer inaugurated this lecture series with a speech on the theme, Africa needs a hand up, not a hand out. Since then, distinguished personalities from West, Central, and Southern Africa, leaders of government and shapers of intelligent opinion, have addressed us on the opportunities and promise of Africa. Common to all the Oppenheimer lectures thus far has been the repeated assertion that honest and open government, social inclusion, and the rights of the individual were necessary features of societies grappling with the need to deliver effective economic development within a secure and just polity. Our Oppenheimer lecturers have helped us to shape IISS work on Africa that is delivered principally through our geoeconomics conferences and research on the security development nexus. We wish to do more on Africa, more in the field of international law, and more in the area of securing development, a phrase first coined at an IISS conference by then World Bank President Robert Zoellick, and since taken up by speakers in the Oppenheimer Lecture series. It's therefore fitting that in this 10th anniversary year, the Oppenheimer Lecture is entitled Justice, Good Governance, and Security. We are thrilled that today it is being delivered by Advocate Madonsela. She is one of the drafters of South Africa's post-apartheid constitution, having forfeited a scholarship to Harvard University to serve her country instead as a technical advisor to the Constitutional Assembly. In 2009, Thuli Madonsela was appointed by unanimous vote of all parties in Parliament South Africa's third public protector. As public protector, her mandate is to investigate and redress improper conduct in state affairs and to resolve associated disputes. During her tenure, Advocate Madonsela has raised the profile of her office nationally and internationally by applying her mandate to the length and breadth of South Africa's state apparatus. She has investigated, among others, state enterprises, the national broadcaster, the ruling party, and even the presidency, when in 2014 she published her Nkandla report summarizing the findings of an 18-month investigation into the expenditure of 246 million rand, some 22.5 million US dollars, for non-essential upgrades to the presidential residence. Despite the enormous administrative challenges she has encountered and strong resistance from those she has investigated, Advocate Madonsela has pursued her mandate with resolute determination. Her unwavering commitment to truth prompted the Daily Maverick to name her South African Person of the Year in 2011. And in 2014, she was recognized by Time as an African public servant, giving us hope for the future in their list of the 100 most influential people in the world. Her intellect, her personal courage, her determination commend her to this audience, and so it's a delight to offer this podium to Advocate Madonsela to deliver the 10th anniversary Oppenheimer Lecture.
Program Director, also the CEO and Director General of the IISS, Dr. John Chipman, Board of Directors, members who are present here, including the Chairperson, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, greetings. I'm sincerely grateful to the IISS, or the Institute, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, for the honor and privilege of delivering this 10th anniversary Oppenheimer Lecture under the theme Justice, good governance and international security. I also thank the Foundation for making the lecture possible. It's a particular honor to follow on the footsteps of leadership giants such as the DBS chairperson or chairman, Nico Oppenheimer, Liberia's President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Nigerian former Minister of Finance Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, President of Mozambique Armando Guebuza, President of Rwanda Paul Kagame, and former Senegalese Prime Minister Aminata Touré, among others. All of these have delivered the lecture in the last 10 years. We must applaud the IISS for bringing us together to share our thoughts on an issue that bedevils our only common habitat as humanity. I'm certain you will agree with me that global peace and global warming are probably the most critical threats that are threatening our existence in this planet today. Because you will say poverty is another threat, but other people don't see poverty as threatening them directly. It threatens them through the acts of others. I would like to indicate up front, though, that I do not purport to engage you as an expert on global security or peace. Despite having been labeled and reportedly investigated as a spy, I stand before you as a fellow citizen who is concerned about our troubled common habitat, planet Earth. My thoughts are principally shaped by my work as the Power Protector of South Africa. The office I head is an administrative watchdog or an administrative accountability body. You are probably aware of these administrative accountability watchdogs, as they have become part of the democracy landscape in all continents, albeit existing under varying labels with varying powers from region to region and from country to country. In some countries, these offices are called an ombudsman office, but that's a misnomer because, for example, here in the UK, if I mention ombudsman, you think administrative justice or maladministration. But if you're in Singapore, if you think ombudsman, you think corruption. If you are in Rwanda, you think corruption, you think ethics, you think maladministration. In South Africa, of course, we deal with all of those: maladministration, ethics, and corruption, among other things. Incidentally, it is said that the inception of the Administrative Oversight Office of this nature was an innovation introduced to augment the traditional checks and balances that have been created over time to curb excesses in the exercise of state power. We are told that the King of Sweden introduced an oversight office such as this one when there was a threat of violence, there was a potential of violence or domestic instability, which had been fueled by bad governance that had set in during his absence. So he came back, he had seen something like this in the East, and he thought it would help. I come from a continent where our collective governance structure, the African Union, has boldly adopted a roadmap that has committed the African continent to a program called Silencing of the Guns in Africa by 2020, which is obviously appropriate for a discussion on peace, security, and justice. And our continent's political leaders have also adopted a strategy and vision called Agenda 2063. That's a roadmap that defines the Africa we want and how we are going to arrive there. And in the roadmap, it spells out the ultimate Africa to be the one that has risen from the ashes like a phoenix, and it is a continent that is functional, it is successful, it is marked by peace, good governance, democracy, and unhampered economic growth and inclusive development. Some of you may have heard about an email that is circulating, which is an email from the current chairperson of the AU Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, written to Kwame Nkrumah and set in 2063, just telling him that the Africa you dreamt of 100 years ago has finally materialized. And it spells out what does that Africa look like. And of course it was all of these things. Among them there's no war, there's no poverty, there's social justice, there's good governance, there's no corruption. But if you look at Agenda 2063, of course the understanding is that the future arrives one day at a time, meaning we will be getting to the Africa we want one day at a time, meaning each day has to look better than the previous one. We also meet today shortly after the United Nations has closed the chapter on the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals and opened the chapter into the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. Of importance to our discussion today is Goal 16, which talks about the promotion of peace and inclusive societies for sustainable development, the provision of access to justice for all, and building effective and accountable institutions at all levels. But the contrast between the world we yearn for and the one we currently inhabit is difficult to ignore, particularly with regard to justice at regional as well as at international level. In my address to people at the University of Western Cape last week, as part of the Desmond Tutu International Peace Lecture, I made the following observations. I quote, "You'll agree with me that other than the two world wars at the beginning of the 20th century, the world has never been in so much turmoil. As humanity, we've never found ourselves in such a desperate search for peace, regardless of where we are, whether we're dealing with violent crime or civil wars domestically, or global terrorism and ongoing conflict between some states. Peace is something the world is desperately searching for right now," close quotes. Indeed, our common habitat has become a very dangerous place for many ordinary people. For many, the uppermost thought today when they wake up and the last thing before they sleep is the question of physical security. Will I be alive tomorrow? This is almost being reduced to the state of primitive societies. In many places, that's the life of women and children. On a day-to-day, they are displaced, often with just clothes on their back. International humanitarian law, as we used to know it, seems to be unable to step in and to help, as ordinary civilians, particularly women and children, have become collateral damage from all sides of the war that they are caught in. In the same way as it happened in primitive societies, or in primitive society wars, women and children are killed, they are tortured, and collected or sold as sex slaves or forced into marriage. As we speak, 200 girls that were captured in northern Nigeria a while ago are still missing. As all of this happens, the center is not holding fast as far as global governance is concerned. For example, the International Criminal Court, conceived and established as a bulwark against impunity for genocide and related heinous crimes, not addressed by domestic courts, is facing a legitimacy crisis. The ICC is accused of targeting alleged criminal acts of African leaders in the face of unilateralism and civil massacres by Western states, principally in Africa and Muslim countries. A related grievance is that some members of the United Nations are allowed to have a say in the ICC affairs or operations, while they themselves are not accountable to it. Linked to this grievance is the perpetuation of colonial inequalities in global governance through exclusive membership of the UN Security Council and the use of its veto powers, which allegedly paralyze accountability efforts concerning some of the member states. We all are aware that more and more powerful states are taking the law into their own hands with regard to military strikes abroad, claiming to be doing so in support of friends or repelling their enemies or security threats. In the midst of these global peace, security, and governance challenges, the AU has announced its intention to encourage its member states to withdraw from the ICC. In the past week, my country, South Africa, has announced its intention to lead in heeding the call to opt out of the ICC. All of this happens at a time some of us are beginning to believe that we are in the midst of a third world war. You're probably thinking that that's rather alarmist. And certainly, those of you who are war experts have quickly reflected on your definition of war, and you're probably raising your eyebrows, and I can see some people raising their eyebrows. But let's reflect for a moment on the state of peace and security in the world. Not an hour passes without news of mass death related to global terrorism, civil war, and war between states. I hope you also agree with me that a convergence of forces, albeit with different interests or strategies, is emerging on the fight against global terrorism that is systematically unleashed by extremist groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Boko Haram. Can our reflections on the role of justice and good governance in regional and international peace provide us with some answers? I'm sharing some views with you on the subject based on a talk I gave at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy conference last year and the Desmond Peace Lecture last week. My proposition is that perceived injustice within and between national states is a threat to international security. I also want us to reflect on the relationship between justice and good governance and how the two impact on global peace and security. My main proposition in this regard is that experienced or perceived injustice, particularly relating to lack of accountability or impunity for harm or wrongdoing, as well as social justice, pose a threat to global peace and security. When I talk about social justice, I would just not talk about social injustice. I would not just talk about inequality, but include there extreme levels of poverty among some and extreme levels of wealth among others. We just learned recently that the 10% of the most richest people in the world account for 67% of the wealth of the world. 10% belongs to 10% owns 67% of the wealth of the world. And in the face of extreme poverty, when some people are said to sleep with 1 meal per week, they're lucky to get 1 meal per week. What about governance? Do good governance and bad governance impact differently on global peace and security? My answer is yes, provided we accept that peace and security transcend the absence of war. I'm certain that as experts, you're probably saying that there is no conclusive data on the nexus between peace and injustice, including social injustice. Well, you're probably right. Yesterday, a friend of mine allowed me to peek into a book with insightful reflections on ongoing debates on the link between inequality and peace challenges. I'm still to read the book, so I can't, at this stage, share the conclusive data with you. But you must agree with me that as long as there's injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. How does justice contribute to peace? Pope Paul VI once said, if you want peace, work for justice. The first woman to be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 1931, Jane Addams, once said, true peace is not merely the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. The very thought behind the ICC was that it would foster peace through justice. It was to make sure that there would be accountability in those cases where at a domestic level there had been impunity. It was to afford victims of war crimes, of genocide, heinous crimes, closure when the domestic instruments and institutions were unable to do so. Indeed, we have seen jubilation in relevant communities whenever a verdict was issued holding an alleged perpetrator of genocide or some other war or related crime accountable. In its simplest form, justice means people have rights as accorded by law, and when those rights are infringed, there must be credible avenues for vindicating those rights. At the core of true justice is accountability. But it's important to note that the existence of laws that are enforced, no matter how rigorously, per se, does not mean there's justice. Even if we have laws that are enforced rigorously, there might still be no justice. As survivors of apartheid and colonialism, we know that the law can be unjust and used as an instrument of oppression. Under feudalism and in oppressive states, the same applies. Law is an instrument of oppression. It is part of creating structural inequality and oppression. So for true justice to obtain, there must be the rule of law. The rule of law generally refers to a state of affairs where people are governed by rules rather than arbitrary decisions of those exercising state or public power. The rules must be general and certain, known by all affected, and uniformly applied or equally applied to all. The World Justice Project identifies the following 4 universal principles as needing to be upheld for the rule of law to be in place. 1, the government and its officials and agents, as well as individuals and private entities, are accountable under the law. 2, the laws are clear, publicized, and just. They are applied evenly and protect fundamental rights, including the security of persons and property. 3, the process by which the laws are enacted, administered, and enforced is accessible, fair, and efficient. 4, justice is delivered timely by competent, ethical, and independent representatives and neutrals who are of sufficient number, have adequate resources, and reflect the makeup of the communities they serve. End quote. Why is the rule of law important for peaceful coexistence? Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, I quote, "The rule of law matters to all of us, to the entire human family. Strengthening the rule of law is an essential ingredient to enhance justice, peace, and economic and social progress. It underpins functional societies and drives development," close quotes. The rule of law's importance to peaceful coexistence lies in the fact that we become part of a collective so that our fortunes are improved and that our fate is better when we're in a collective than when we're alone. If the collective is governed unjustly and we are treated unfairly or excluded from collective resources or benefits, we cannot be happy or peaceful. But is the rule of law only relevant at the domestic level? I don't think so. I think the rule of law principles must apply at regional and global governance levels. If peace is to be fostered, all of the 4 requirements of the rule of law should be applied to regional governance structures and to the global ones such as the UN and related structures. One interesting requirement of the rule of law is that the government and its officials and agents, as well as individuals and private entities, are accountable under the law. I think this one is particularly opposite if you're talking about your regional governance structures and international governance structures. You may be among some of those people, though, that say at times we have to trade peace for justice, or vice versa. If we want peace, we may have to dispense with justice. I don't know. In some of these forums I've been to, that argument has been made. And when we dealt with silence of the guns at a conference under the UN, it was one of the things that was mentioned. Well, can we trade justice for peace? Not if we believe peace is not just merely the absence of open conflict. But I do believe, though, that justice is not just dispensed through the adversarial criminal justice system. Restorative justice may be the best answer in some instances. For example, the foundation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was about restorative justice. The idea was accountability and also a sense of placing the complainant as close as possible to where they would have been but for the wrong. My office operates along those same lines. We seek to ensure that there's no impunity, and when it comes to dealing with the complainant, we seek to ensure that we place them as close as possible to where they would have been had there been no wrongdoing, whether as a person suffering administrative injustice or as a group wronged by the state through corruption or through abuse of power or unethical conduct and status of things. I believe there's no impediment to incorporating principles of restorative justice in international law, including the ICC. What could be done is complainants could be given an option between going the normal criminal justice process or a forum similar to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission with compensation if possible. What about impunity that may be suffered because of powerful business? Where I come from, there are complaints that we are often concerned over criminal impunity where physical harm has been caused to people, but there's another kind of harm: health violations, environmental degradation, and businesses that do not adhere to their social compact. One of the cases that I'm dealing with, for example, is people claiming that they have open cast mining literally in front of their door, and they have headaches because the machines are making noise and they're making movement that makes it impossible for them to live there peacefully. Again, the rule of law applies to such circumstances. So it's not just about accountability of those in government. In fact, if you look at the quotation I had from the World Justice Forum, it's about everyone being accountable, including business, including powerful business, whether national or transnational. From a business point of view, often the result of impunity is not always immediate death. It is diseases that stay. It's open mines that are left there, that where people are now trying to mine illegally there, and people are dying, and it's poverty. Now, what role does good governance play in fostering peace? You'll note that the rule of law definition from the World Justice Forum includes elements of good governance. For example, people need to participate meaningfully in the making of those laws, and those that deliver justice have to be competent, ethical, and deliver services expeditiously. And there has to be access to justice for everyone, including the poor. But what happens then in nation states and regions, or particularly in nation states where maybe the court system is inadequate to ensure that there's adequate accountability? But some of the states would have the justice system plus the administrative accountability instruments that I've spoken about, including an office such as mine. In civil society, they would have arbitration and other forms of informal justice. But often there's a gap, and that's why you have instruments such as the IEC. I thought I would just, before I end, talk a bit about why do we need these global instruments. Well, firstly, because as a world we are interconnected. What happens in Jamaica has implications for what happens in South Africa, because we've become a global village. And if we ignore what happens in justice there, we do so at our peril. I've often told about a poem of somebody who was very visionary about our interdependence as humanity, some guy by the name of James Patrick Kinney. He wrote a poem about more than half a century ago. There are about 6 people that were together with a fire that was dying, and it was dark, cold, and the fire was dying, and all of them had some wood or a piece of wood that they could use. But none of them could use it for different reasons. And so often we have reasons why we don't want to participate in some of these global solutions or even country solutions. In James Patrick Kinney's situation, the first person didn't do so because he looked across and saw somebody who was from a different race than him and thought, no, I'm not going to get that person benefit from my log. The second one saw somebody from a different church and said, no, I'm not going to benefit somebody from a different church. The third person was a rich person. He looked across and saw a poor person and said, the lazy poor, I'm not going to let them benefit from my log. The poor person, not knowing what the rich person across was thinking, he thought, the filthy rich, he's not getting my log, and he kept it. Another one from a different race from the first one looked across and saw that most of these people are from a different race from me, and he decided, no, I am not going to give them my log. In fact, he thought this was an opportunity for revenge because the people across the room were coming from a race that had been historically advantaged and exploitative, and he kept his log. The last person was a mercenary, a person who had never done anything but for gain, and he looked around and said, these people are not going to be in a position to pay me for my wood, and he decided not to give the piece of wood. And James Patrick Kinney ends the poem by saying they did not die from the cold without, they died from the cold within. In other words, they lacked human solidarity, which is a simple principle primitive societies knew all along, that I am because you are. So if I save you, I increase my own chances of survival in the woods as people lived there. Now, what does that have to do with good governance? Well, firstly, people get into societies to improve their fortunes, and if their fortunes do not improve, or if they feel that they are treated unjustly or relegated to the margins of society, they are vulnerable, or a lot of them are vulnerable to temptations for opting out. It is possible that although civil war may be fueled by greed, the ordinary people who join and embrace such missions are those who feel left out of society. It is possible that a key push factor towards global terrorism, for example, is a feeling of exclusion from democratic processes and common resources, is also a deep sense of injustice, of feeling injustice. Some of you, I'm speaking to a country where I'm certain that all of you have watched The Phantom of the Opera, and you will recall that scene when he's being asked about why is he unleashing these vicious attacks on fellow human beings, and he says, society has never shown compassion to me, and why should I show them compassion? And perhaps if we think about injustice that comes from poorly governed societies where resources maybe go to corruption or resources abused due to ineptitude, those who are left at the margin of society have very little to lose. And so what does that have anything to do with you? If, for example, that kind of disorder is happening in a country far away, maybe in Thailand or in South Africa, what has it got to do with you? Well, if we look at James Patrick Kenny, it has a lot to do with you, because injustice there may create instability in the world. We're talking right now about problems of a refugee crisis because people are migrating, but also angry people, wherever they are, may become a global threat to you wherever you are. So the African Union is aware of that. When they talk about silencing of the guns in Africa, for example, the AU is looking at good governance as one of the factors that can ensure that there's silencing of the guns. And one of the areas that have been targeted as part of good governance is democracy. And when we were on the panel, we flagged an issue there that every time we talk about democracy, we talk about majority rule. But often majority rule is about formal democracy. Because if the majority is a particular group and they will make all of the decisions, the others are not participating. And during the silencing of the guns conference, the idea was we have to start looking at substantive democracy, not formal democracy. And former President Nelson Mandela was used as an example of somebody who was committed to substantive democracy, which would mean that the majority at times has to pull back a bit and allow the numerical minorities space to express themselves as part of making sure that we go beyond formal democracy and we have substantive democracy. Because if that doesn't happen, then there'll be unrest in parts of the world and the rest of the world may be affected. So the last point I was going to make there is, why should you care? Of course you should care, like James Patrick Kenny said. But the last point I would like to make is the question of accountability through courts as part of a functional democracy and governance. And there's no doubt in my mind and in your mind that the justice system, preferably pure, impartial, and uncorrupted, is part of the pillars of a functional state and is part of the buffers against unrest. So it's part of our insurance for peace. But what about justice and accountability when the alleged wrongdoers are powerful state actors still in office? Well, the question of access to justice and accountability for state wrongs is particularly important in the complex modern state. In the face of large, powerful, and often oppressive or indifferent bureaucracies, the traditional checks and balances for accountability are not enough. And in some of the modern states, then you have two buffers to improve justice and accountability. The first one is the domestic avenues beyond the courts, such as the public protector and human rights commissions, etc., that provide another layer of accountability, making it easier for people to engage in meaningful dialogue with the state, regardless of how powerful those in power are. The second level, of course, is international forums. You would have forums, for example, in Africa, where they start a tribunal, and we have AU accountability structures, and at the global community, we have various ones, including the ICC. We know that domestic enforcement agencies often fail. What happens then? What is important for peace and democracy during our times, for me, is that civil society should be active. Civil society should be part of the accountability mechanism, even if it's not a structure like a court or a tribunal or a public protector or an administrative thing. The media, as part of civil society, becomes an important part of strengthening, of ensuring justice. So when we're looking at justice, it's just not just the courts. But what if all of that has failed? And that's where the ICC becomes important in other international structures. But we have legitimate, are the grievances against the ICC illegitimate? I think no, they are legitimate, and they need to be addressed. But can ordinary people in Africa, particularly women and girls, those we refer to as grandmother Dlaminis, can they afford a vacuum where there's absolutely nothing? I would like us to ponder that, because just going forward, I would like to say that we need to rethink global governance. We need to look at those principles of the rule of law and see in what way are we going to apply them to global governance. We need to continue to support each other in terms of making sure that states are functional and that there's good governance within states. We need to make sure that we reduce unilateral action, because it encourages people to think that whoever is powerful can decide what's just and enforce justice their way. But what happens whilst we're still trying to reform the global governance system? My country has said we should work hard in the meantime. My view would be we should beg my country and others not to do so. To say half a loaf is better than no bread. I've not heard a single person saying that the IEC has convicted anyone wrongly. The complaint is that there is selective targeting. Well, when I went there to The Hague last year, they had their own explanation, but I think that may be fair criticism, that the system allows that kind of targeting. But in our criminal justices, in the domestic setup, some criminals go away, or get away. Would we have to close our criminal justice system because some of them get away? No. We have to keep trying to improve the system. Because I just think that the people are going to suffer more if we totally leave the ICC, the grandmother Dlaminis, or the Gogo Dlaminis as we call them, the women in Africa who will have absolutely no recourse. Because the ICC, it wasn't just about it capturing those people and bring them to the system, it was also people thinking about the possibility that one day they would go there. If Africa walks away, will it be left with Africa in an interconnected world? I doubt so. I think it may well be possible that Asia will walk away and somebody else will walk away. So what would be the solution going forward? My view is we should, of course, strengthen the domestic governance systems and ensure that we have sustainable peace, number one. Two, the efforts at UN and AU level that are about ensuring social justice, breaching the inequality gap, and eliminating poverty should be strengthened. Regarding the ICC, I would say that if continents want to break away from it, such as Africa, let's create then an African court, an African criminal court that will open its doors the day the ICC closes its door to Africa. But as we do so, we should make sure that that structure is truly independent and we're committed to it, and it doesn't suffer the same fate as the SADC tribunal. What about the rest of the world while we're still waiting for reform? My request is that we should rethink unilateral military interventions. Because if it's one country can do it, the other one thinks it can do it as well. How do you decide that the one is benevolent and pursuing true justice and the one is not benevolent and pursuing ill intent? Who makes that decision if all of those decisions are happening outside the UN? Perhaps it's high time that we reformed the UN itself and make sure that it is inclusive. You will recall that the rule of law as we know it includes ensuring that democracy is inclusive and that the structures that supervise and enforce justice represent all of the parties that will be held accountable for it. Lastly, I just want to thank all of you for this opportunity, and but particularly to thank the IISS for this discussion. It cannot end here. I think it's a long discussion, but just lastly, the issue is global governance need to be rethought. Domestic states need to advance what they are doing when it comes to strengthening the justice system and when it comes to dealing with social injustice. I would like to leave you with these words from former President Nelson Mandela. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I know that there'll be an awful lot of questions on what you said, and even more questions on what perhaps you haven't said. Could I ask the question that at least 4 times during your remarks you begged to be asked, and so I must ask it, and that is that a little while ago the President of Sudan visited South Africa, and then he left South Africa, but he didn't leave to go to the ICC, left to go home. And I wonder what your advice would have been, given the very important emphasis you placed in your remarks on the importance of the International Criminal Court to your president. How should he have better balanced his perceived obligations to the African Union and his legal obligations to the International Criminal Court?
Thank you. I didn't realize I was getting into that problem, but I suppose I asked for it. For him, of course, I would think that currently he got involved because they were a signatory to the Rome Statute. And I would say every country that is still a signatory to the Rome Statute should comply with their obligations. It's really part of the rule of law. If you then choose to opt out, you can do so, but before you opt out, you must comply. I do have a view, though, about opting out as well, which is a discussion we had in Sweden. It's something called the Tollberg Forum, that the problem with global governance, which includes AU governance, is that leaders make those decisions on our behalf as citizens. It would be interesting if a referendum would be taken in Africa, whether the African people would say opt out of the ICC. I don't know. I think they might actually say they don't want to opt out of the ICC because there has to be some kind of accountability, whilst, of course, the issues about reform, they should be made.
Thank you. Fleur de Villiers?
Thank you, Dr. Mandela. It is on. Right. The question that runs right through your talk, and it was very thoughtful and thought-provoking, was the age-old question of whose justice. It's all very well to talk about justice, but whose justice is the most important qualification, which has and would, but for your presence and your judgment in South Africa, arguably have become the president's justice rather than the people's justice. If you hadn't found, as you did, on the Nkandla issue, and continue to investigate problems and the rise in the press, that while they may still be ventilated in the strongly free South African press, tend to be ignored by the people in power, who sometimes, one suspects, having assumed power, do not recognize the difference between the published post and the private post. I'd be grateful for your thoughts.
Thank you. It's quite an appropriate question and an interesting question about whose justice. It's a thesis on its own about what do we regard as justice. I would say for me, though, the easiest way to look at justice, both at international level and at domestic level, is to stick to the instruments. So if I was looking at justice from an international level, I would start with the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and I would look at all instruments that we've all signed and approved, and I would also look at customary international law. In South Africa, if I was looking at what would be just, I would start with the Constitution, which in South Africa spells out the vision of society, the character of the state, and the values that underpin the state. And in the character of the state, it also includes the fact that those who exercise public power should do so ethically, and particularly that public power should be used primarily in the interest of the people. And obviously public resources should also primarily be used in the interest of the people. It also, our laws would say that according to the Constitutional Court in a case called MEC, Kumalo versus MEC for Education, KwaZulu-Natal, is that those who are employed by the state, of course, their remuneration is determined by law and their rights are determined by law. And who is employed by the state, it starts from cleaner to president. So the justice would be as in the Constitution and the laws of the country, regardless of who the public protector would be. And I would say at international law, it would be really the same. If we were to stick to not looking at who is involved and deal with international law accordingly. As somebody who looked at international law, humanitarian law, these days I get confused, for example, about what are the rights of civilians. Should they be collateral damage? When we studied international law, then they shouldn't have been. It's all about sticking to the scripts. Of course, there will be dilemmas at times.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Comment and a question, if I'm allowed. The comment is that I think when we look at recent trends towards the ICC in Africa, it's important not to lose sight of how much work has been done by some of those governments who are currently under investigation in terms of actually lobbying. I mean, the Kenyan government, for example, has, I think, at least 50 diplomatic missions to different African countries to try and persuade people to adopt this position on the ICC. And I think that's been an important catalyst. It's important not to lose sight of that. But I wanted to ask you a question about a different way in which the ICC is limited. You talked completely accurately, I think, and rightly about the legitimacy problem of the ICC, almost the PR problem we now see, and the question of selective justice. But there's a second, even bigger question, I think, which threatens the kind of legitimacy and credibility of the international justice program, which is the fact that the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction in the countries in which it operates. So we see in the Kenyan case, no witness protection program, no ability to actually go and get information and evidence on what may or may not be happening around the ICC witnesses in terms of intimidation. Because effectively you cannot operate unless the state wants you to operate and wants to support you. And that suggests to me that actually political elites in Africa have started to realize that international justice can't hurt them unless they really open themselves up. And that creates a very dangerous precedent for how future elites will be treated and will treat the ICC even if they agree to go to The Hague. Because that lack of witness protection program and that lack of investigative capacity means it's really difficult for the ICC, for example, to find that a country like Kenya is in contempt. So I wonder what you think we might do about that practical challenge rather than the theoretical one that you spoke so eloquently about.
More people should know who you are. So could you just remind us of your name and affiliation?
Oh, sorry, I'm Professor Cheeseman from Oxford University.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You're right that there may have been some lobbying for the AU to take the position it eventually took. But again, it was lobbying, as Mr. Villiers said, it was lobbying the leaders, not the people, which for me then that creates a disjuncture between what may the people be actually thinking versus what the leaders are thinking. Creating possibly a need for rethinking modern democracy to bring the people a little bit more closer. I've seen some of the new constitutions now on very controversial issues. They require a referendum. So maybe that could then make sure that despite the leaders being lobbied, there is still a people's thing. Regarding the point that you're raising about the ICC having no jurisdiction in the domestic setups it's supposed to operate, I think it's a valid point. In an ideal setup where there is no animosity within the ICC, this would be an issue that they should now sit together, the global partners, to look at it and say, if we want this structure to be effective, we need to make sure that the environment provides it with optimal opportunity to catch the real wrongdoers. And I remember reading something that was saying that the most successful cases have been those cases where the government is not a sitting government, where the referral has been for a regime that has lost power. But it again begs the question about whether the ICC, like if we're looking long-term, much more long-term, is the ICC the only option? I'm not personally averse to regional structures, except as long as they are truly independent and they don't suffer the same fate as the SADC tribunal. Recently, we were made aware of a structure, was it in Colombia, where they have created, it's not Colombia, I'm just gonna check my notes on that one, where in a country they've created a global forum, but it's in a country, but it's independent, and it was able to make sure that even though the wrongdoing is by a regime that is in power at the time, there was no impunity. So we have to begin to think like, but I have nothing to really add about what you've said, because you're right. It's just a question of, we need to go back again to the UN and say, is it possible that you could have more powers without undermining the sovereignty of a national state.
Ben Barry.
I'm from the Institute. I found myself in instinctive agreement with much of what you say. It's very compelling. But I think at the international level, there are some formidable legal difficulties. And that is that countries all view international law, be it the Charter of the United Nations, the law of international armed conflict and international humanitarian law, from the perspective of their own national culture and their own national law. So US government officials would argue that the CIA program of drone strikes is perfectly legal under US domestic law. Under their interpretations of international law, it's also legal. And many countries have different interpretations of the right of self-defense. For example, that was used by the British government to justify a recent drone strike against British citizens in Syria. There are all sorts of other examples that can create real practical friction, for example, on different rules of engagement of different contingents on United Nations operations, even though they've got a Security Council mandate. And I wonder whether your thinking has considered that inconvenient, complicating factor.
I have considered it, but I will not purport to be an expert on international law, Dr. Bowell. All I can say, though, it's part of the problems that I've referred to, because if the US or the UK would say it's a preemptive strike, we are flushing out enemies, or we are assisting a friend, Russia then does the same thing in the Ukraine. It becomes difficult to say who will be then the final arbiter to say Russia is wrong, US and UK are right. Those are the things that people have been grappling with in some of the forums I've been to, Kutolbek Forum, the World Justice Forum, and our own forums as ombudsmen, is that once there's exceptionalism, others also want to have that exceptionalism. And I think when the UN started after the Second World War, there was less of that exceptionalism. There was a sense of everything has to happen within that global governance. And perhaps then we should reform that global governance to provide in a much more open and transparent way for those exceptions. Because if we don't do, everyone then has their own interpretation. And unfortunately, those who suffer are the collateral damage victims. But I must say, though, that I'm not offering an answer about where do we go. In fact, in the written speech, I realized that was taking a lot of time. In the written speech, I spoke about the whole question of defensive strikes. My sense of it is that until we have found a way of healing the divisions that have caused the tension, we have no option but to find a way, we have no option but to use some of the military solutions, but whilst working at a much more sustainable way of bringing everyone back to the human family. But it should happen within the structure of the global governance structures, which would be the UN. There has to be that kind of arrangement. I think unilateralism has allowed, sort of created legitimacy to other people using unilateralism as well.
And the gentleman just behind, if you give us your name, please. Thank you.
This is Tabiso Mahlobo. I'm from the diplomatic team in the South Africa House. That way to Tuli. Thank you very much for being the great advocate for justice, good governance, and international security, and bringing this lecture to us here on this Oppenheimer lecture. You made such a good example about that poet James Patrick Kinney, and those different views that the people had to assist their fellow human being or who was in distress. In this world, as you gave us this one beautiful narrative, world of greed and power and greed, do you see in this dark cloud a silver lining of hope, with all the dynamics that you have elaborated to us. What do you see standing tall from that beautiful country with so much dynamics and looking at the world and from our history and to the history today? Thank you.
You're asking a very difficult question, but an important question. But my first answer is there is a glimmer of hope. And in the written paper, I mentioned that everyone today basically understands that we are interconnected, or the majority of people now beginning to understand that we are interconnected and that we are all in trouble. If you look at the UN's adoption of Sustainable Goal number 16, it is an acknowledgement that peace is an important thing. It's also an acknowledgement of the interrelationship between peace, social justice, and inclusive development. And they brought in issues of governance, the good governance. So that's a glimmer of hope in that there is that. The AU itself, Agenda 2063, is forward-looking. The AU may not have handled the ICC matter as well as some of us believe they could have. The attempt to throw the baby away with the bathwater might not be the best. But we've seen the AU follow through with its silencing the guns in Africa strategy. When war broke in Burkina Faso, in fact, we were on the silencing of the guns conference. We were sitting on a panel like this when the news broke that things had happened in Burkina Faso, and they immediately sent a team there. The first time it happened, they immediately sent a team there to make sure that the state was not used to kill people and to allow the third term at the time that the third term was being considered. And now again, when the war broke in Burkina Faso, you saw the AU again moving in to assist and enforce justice. We also saw the AU when in Burundi, the fellow they went, the president, they went for what again you would call formal democracy as opposed to substantive democracy, because everyone was looking at 2 terms means 2 terms, and when he went for 3 terms, the AU disagreed with that. So again, there's a bit of following through with that. In South Africa, I think we have a hope-inspiring situation there, in that in the midst of despair, we've been able to come up with a constitution that sets up the state as I spoke about, which is creates an inclusive society where everyone's life is improved and everyone's potential has been free. And there has been challenges. I was speaking to Mr. Villas earlier. I think, no, it wasn't you. It was some journalist about, but the rule of law might be under threat in South Africa. And I said that, no, if you look at what Madiba said, even the most benevolent of states have within them the propensity for wrongdoing. And that's why we've had these structures built to reinforce democracy. And those structures include the courts. And the courts in South Africa are yet to drop the ball. Whilst there are challenges here and there in different countries about the judiciary, with the South African judiciary, when it comes to the constitution, I am not aware of any legitimate concern. I think they've been there as the final bulwark. And the lessons coming from the judiciary, then they go back to society and all structures. And also in South Africa, what we're seeing civil society rising. Not rising in an ugly way of guns and things like that, but just civil society rising and expressing its views on good governance, on what do we need to continue marching towards the South Africa we want peacefully. Thank you.
Advocate Madonsela, thank you so very much for making a special trip to the United Kingdom just for this lecture. You do us a great honor to have accepted this lecture. You arrived yesterday. You're going back tomorrow. You were appointed Public Protector in 2009. It's a fixed term. The Republic of South Africa is very fortunate to have you as their Public Protector. Let's hope you have set a precedent and that you will have a great successor. But for the words you've given us today, for the thoughts on this not very narrow topic of justice, good governance, and international security, thank you very much. You referred to your written statement. We long to have it. We'll put it on our website. You've given us lots to think about. And Godspeed, best of luck, and thank you very much for your mission in South Africa, but also for what you've contributed to this larger debate. Thank you very much.